Japanese generals couldn't believe American factories produced 100,000 planes in WW2 December 7, 1941. The Pacific skies over Oahu burned crimson as Japanese Zeros screamed low across Pearl Harbor, their machine guns stitching fire into battleship decks. Black smoke billowed upward in twisting towers, blotting out the Hawaiian sun. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the pinnacle of precision, the masterstroke of a nation that believed its warriors had no equal. Yet, beneath the thunder of explosions and the roar of engines, a deeper tremor stirred, one that Japanese generals could not yet see. This was not the tremor of destruction, but of awakening. For in that single morning, America, wounded, humiliated, but not broken, was ignited into a war that would unleash not only soldiers and sailors, but also the full force of a colossal industrial machine. The Japanese admirals had calculated carefully. Their fleet had sailed with secrecy, their pilots had trained with fanatical discipline, and their high command had convinced itself of a truth, that the United States, decadent and divided, lacked the steel in its spine to rebuild, let alone outmatch the empire of the rising sun. They believed they had knocked America down, but what they had truly done was provoke the industrial colossus into a fury beyond comprehension. Picture the smoke clearing at Pearl Harbor. Imagine Japanese officers gathered in Tokyo days later, tracing maps with their hands, measuring distances with compasses, speaking with the certainty of men who thought they understood the enemy. They calculated American ship losses, projected replacement schedules, and assured themselves that Japan had at least 2 years of supremacy before the United States could recover. Yet they did not factor in what lay behind the American battlefield: the endless valleys of steel in Pittsburgh, the roaring furnaces of Detroit, the rolling belts of Chicago, and the humming assembly lines of Los Angeles. They did not understand that America's battlefield was not only on the ocean waves or island jungles, but in the very factories where machines thundered day and night. In Tokyo, war planners comforted themselves with numbers. America had fewer than 3,000 combat aircraft ready for service in 1941. Japan alone had produced over 5,000 planes in that same year. Germany had built nearly 12,000. To Japanese eyes, the United States was a nation of consumers, not warriors, a land of automobiles and washing machines, not bombers and fighters. They could not imagine that within just 4 years, that same United States would produce an avalanche of more than 100,000 warplanes, a tide of aluminum, rivets, and roaring engines unlike anything in human history. The first hints of this storm came quietly. In December 1941, while battleships still smoldered in Pearl Harbor, factories in Michigan, Ohio, and California began to shift. The Ford Motor Company, once the symbol of Model T prosperity, now retooled its River Rouge complex to build bombers. Douglas Aircraft ramped up lines in Santa Monica. Boeing's plants in Seattle expanded their wingspan, building B-17s that would soon crisscross oceans. The scale of these mobilizations was invisible to the Japanese high command, hidden beneath the haze of their early victories in Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. To them, America remained distant and unthreatening. But behind the smoke and steel, a juggernaut was rising. The Japanese Zero, sleek, maneuverable, and deadly in the opening months, had become a symbol of dominance. American planes burned by the dozens across Pacific outposts. Yet, unknown to Japanese strategists, America's strength was not in the quality of any single machine at the start, but in the relentless multiplication of machines at a pace the world had never seen. By 1942, American factories were producing aircraft at a rate of 20,000 a year. By 1943, that number doubled. And by 1944, American skies thundered with the wings of nearly 100,000 aircraft built in a single year. Imagine the shock of Japanese generals receiving their intelligence reports. Thousands of B-24 Liberators rolling out of Ford's Willow Run plant, where an aircraft assembly line stretched for more than a mile. One completed bomber, a Leviathan with 4 engines and 18,000 parts, emerged every 63 minutes. Where once families drove away in gleaming sedans, now formations of bombers rolled forward, wings gleaming in the morning light. It was as if America had turned its entire nation into a single weapon. The scale defied belief. The United States built not only fighters to contest the skies, but also transports to carry divisions, gliders to drop paratroopers, trainers for young cadets, reconnaissance planes to scout the seas, and bombers to burn cities into ash. Every type, every role, every purpose, and in numbers that seemed impossible. Over the course of the war, American factories delivered more than 300,000 aircraft. For the Japanese, who had believed in the precision strike, the short war, and the knockout blow, this reality was incomprehensible. On the front lines, the evidence became undeniable. By 1943, American carriers that had once fielded a handful of fighters now launched squadrons in waves, their decks crowded with Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs. In the skies above Guadalcanal and later the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots who once fought with dominance now found themselves swarmed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 1944, saw more than 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single battle, a massacre in the sky that marked the collapse of Japan's aerial strength. The pilots who survived returned to their carriers in shock, whispering to each other the same haunting truth: the Americans never run out of planes. This was the nightmare the Japanese General Staff had failed to imagine. The war was no longer a contest of skill alone, but of industrial output. America did not send one bomber at a time. It sent hundreds. It did not train one pilot. It trained tens of thousands. And as each new wave of aircraft thundered across the Pacific, the truth grew clear: Japanese bravery, discipline, and even technology could not withstand the storm of numbers. What made this transformation most terrifying to Japanese observers was its speed. In less than 3 years, the United States had not only replaced its losses, but also multiplied its air power beyond imagination. Where once America had been mocked as soft, complacent, and unprepared, it now appeared as a machine of war, faceless, inexhaustible, and unstoppable. The silence inside Japanese war councils grew heavier as reports flooded in. Carrier after carrier lost. Factories in Nagoya, Yokohama, and Tokyo reduced to ash by endless B-29 raids. Entire cities burned, not by the sword of the samurai, but by the wings of industrial fire. Generals stared at maps that shrank each month, islands turning red with American flags, supply lines cut, and the empire contracting. And beneath their disbelief lay a bitter truth: they had awakened a giant not of flesh, but of iron and steel. The story of America's 100,000 warplanes was not only about machines, but also about vision. It was the vision of mobilizing an entire nation, of transforming automobile lines into bomber lines, of turning ordinary workers into the arsenal of democracy. It was a story the Japanese generals never believed possible until the skies themselves proved them wrong. And as the war dragged on, one haunting thought lingered in the minds of Japan's leaders: they had launched a war against a nation they thought weak and instead unleashed the most fearsome industrial power the world had ever seen. WWII 1942. The Pacific was a chessboard of fire and steel. Japan's empire stretched like a crimson tide across Asia and the Pacific, engulfing Manchuria, Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, the Philippines, and countless islands scattered like pearls across the ocean. The rising sun flag flew over territories that only months before had been thought impregnable. The Japanese soldier, disciplined, relentless, forged in years of conquest in China, seemed unstoppable. From the shores of Singapore to the jungles of New Guinea, Allied troops reeled back in shock. Britain, battered from the Blitz and stretched across too many fronts, could offer little resistance in the Far East. Australia, isolated and exposed, braced itself for invasion. The world watched in awe and terror as Japanese forces surged forward with breathtaking speed. Yet behind the maps and victories lay assumptions that would soon unravel. Japan's strategy was built on the concept of the decisive battle, a strike so sharp and devastating that America would have no choice but to sue for peace. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, believed that if Japan could destroy America's Pacific Fleet and seize its island bases, it could fortify a defensive perimeter that no enemy could penetrate. Behind these defenses, Japan would consolidate its empire, harvest resources from the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, and bleed America's will to fight until Washington conceded defeat. It was a gamble rooted in confidence, but also in underestimation. Japanese war planners studied America's peacetime forces, its small standing army, its scattered fleet, and its sluggish political process. They concluded that the United States was a sleeping giant, rich but complacent, a nation with little appetite for long, bloody wars. They assumed America's industrial heart was vast but slow, requiring years to awaken. They expected America's people to fracture under the strain of sacrifice. But what they did not see was the other side of the American character. For behind the neon lights of Times Square, the dusty roads of Kansas, and the motor factories of Detroit, there was a spirit forged in the crucible of the Great Depression. An entire generation had known hardship, unemployment, breadlines, and hunger. Now, when the call came, they responded not with despair, but with grim determination. And when that determination was harnessed to industry, it became a weapon unlike any the world had ever faced. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that wars were not won only by armies and navies, but by the factories that supplied them. In his speeches, he called America the arsenal of democracy, declaring that the nation would not merely arm itself, but arm the entire free world. Under his leadership, America began to mobilize in a way that stunned allies and enemies alike. Factories retooled overnight. Automobile plants that once rolled out shiny Buicks and Cadillacs now produced tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Civilian industries shifted to war production with breathtaking speed. The scale of the mobilization was staggering. In 1940, America had built fewer than 3,000 aircraft. By 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, that number had jumped to 20,000. By 1942, it surged past 47,000, and it would not stop there. Soon, production targets soared so high they seemed impossible, 125,000 planes in a single year. The numbers alone defied imagination, but the reality was even more astonishing. America had the resources, steel, aluminum, oil, rubber, and, perhaps more importantly, the organizational genius to turn raw material into weapons at scale. Japan, by contrast, faced constraints it could never escape. Its island homeland was poor in resources. It relied on imports of oil, iron, ore, and rubber, much of it seized in its conquests. Every month, Allied submarines prowling the Pacific choked those supply lines tighter. Japanese factories worked furiously, but they were small, scattered, and vulnerable to bombing. Their output could never match the assembly lines of Detroit or Seattle. And while Japanese soldiers and pilots carried the burden of centuries of warrior tradition, they could not compensate for the crushing mathematics of production. In Europe, Germany too underestimated the storm building across the Atlantic. Hitler sneered at America as a mongrel nation, unfit for sustained war. He pointed to the softness of its youth, the distractions of its consumer culture, and the divisions of its politics. Yet even as his panzer divisions rampaged across Russia, his generals warned him that American production could tip the balance. They were right. By 1943, German soldiers in Tunisia and Italy were already facing the reality. The Americans might lack experience, but they never seemed to run out of equipment, fuel, or air support. The contrast in doctrine was stark. Japan emphasized the individual warrior, the pilot with samurai discipline, and the infantryman with bayonet and courage. America emphasized the system, networks of supply, the coordination of factories, and the relentless logistics of war. Japan believed in striking fast and hoping the enemy collapsed. America believed in grinding its enemies down with overwhelming force. It was the collision of two philosophies, spirit against system, tradition against modernity. For the Japanese high command, the first months of war seemed to confirm their vision. Victories rolled in one after another: Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore, and Java. But beneath the euphoria, cracks were already forming. America had not collapsed. Its factories had not slowed. On the contrary, they were accelerating. Every aircraft lost at Pearl Harbor was replaced tenfold. Every ship sunk was avenged by two more launched. What Japan could not comprehend was that Pearl Harbor had not destroyed America's resolve. It had galvanized it to by mid-1942. The shift was already evident. At the Battle of Midway, Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, American carriers, repaired, reinforced, and rearmed with new planes, dealt Japan a blow from which it would never fully recover. 4 Japanese carriers, the core of the Pearl Harbor strike force, were sent to the bottom. For Japanese generals, the shock was profound. How had America rebuilt so quickly? How had it fielded fresh aircraft, trained new pilots, and mounted such an audacious counterstrike in mere months? The answer was not found on the decks of carriers, but in the roaring furnaces and assembly lines of the American heartland. From this moment, the war shifted. No longer would Japan's generals fight an enemy they could dominate through surprise. Now they faced a rival whose resources seemed endless, whose factories operated without pause, and whose will only hardened with each passing month. What they had dismissed as weakness was in fact the very foundation of strength, the capacity to organize, to produce, and to outlast. And as 1942 gave way to 1943 and then to 1944, the skies over the Pacific would grow ever darker with the shadows of American bombers and fighters. Shadows cast not only by wings of steel, but also by the thunder of an industrial empire that Japan could never hope to match. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first rumble of distant thunder before a storm breaks. On the front lines, Japanese soldiers and pilots noticed something strange. The Americans never seemed to run out of machines. A fighter shot down one week was replaced by another the next. A bomber formation torn apart over Rabaul reappeared days later in equal or greater numbers. Japanese intelligence officers scratched their heads, recalculating production figures, but the numbers refused to make sense. For every Japanese aircraft built, America seemed to roll out 5, then 10. It was as if the skies themselves were breeding new squadrons overnight. The hidden advantage was not courage, nor even technology alone. It was industry harnessed with ruthless efficiency. The Americans had tapped into something Japan never truly grasped: the transformation of civilian factories into engines of war. What Japan considered a weakness, America's obsession with consumer goods, became its greatest weapon. The same assembly lines that had once produced millions of cars, refrigerators, and radios now produced tanks, ships, and above all, aircraft. At it first, Japanese generals could not comprehend the scale. Their own factories were artisanal by comparison, relying on meticulous handcrafting and small-batch production. Planes were built with care, almost as works of art, assembled by skilled craftsmen in facilities vulnerable to bombing and resource shortages. In contrast, America treated aircraft like automobiles, standardized, mass-produced, and interchangeable. If one machine was destroyed, another rolled off the line in hours. If a part failed, it was replaced instantly from warehouses stocked like supermarkets of war. Consider Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a facility so vast it seemed to stretch to the horizon. Designed by engineer Charles Sorensen and backed by the relentless vision of Henry Ford, it was the first true aircraft assembly line in history. B-24 Liberators, massive 4-engine bombers, rolled through the line step by step, wings joined to fuselages, engines bolted into place, and turrets mounted like teeth onto a jaw. At the peak of its power, Willow Run produced one complete bomber every hour, a rhythm of steel and sweat unmatched anywhere else on Earth. Japanese intelligence could scarcely believe the reports. How could an enemy build a machine as complex as a bomber with the same casual speed as a sedan? Yet the truth was undeniable. America had not just adapted its industries to war. It had reinvented warfare itself through production. But the hidden advantage was not merely in numbers. It was also in networks. American production was spread across a continent, shielded from bombing by oceans, and guarded by natural abundance. Aluminum poured out of new refineries in Washington and Tennessee. Engines thundered from Pratt and Whitney in Connecticut, General Motors in Ohio, and Wright Aeronautical in New Jersey. Wings were riveted in California, fuselages stamped in Kansas, and landing gear forged in Pennsylvania. Parts crisscrossed the nation on railroads, converging in factories like arteries feeding a heart. Each plant was only a piece of a greater organism, the industrial leviathan of the United States. For Japan, this was unthinkable. Its homeland was compact, resource-starved, and increasingly strangled by blockade. Factories struggled to meet even modest quotas. and as the war dragged on, their quality declined. Planes rolled off the lines with weaker engines, inferior steel, and fewer replacements. Where America's pilots could rely on a steady stream of new machines, Japanese aviators often fought in aircraft patched together from spare parts on the battlefields. This hidden advantage began to manifest. In 1942, Japanese pilots still dominated the skies with their nimble Zeros. But by 1943, new American designs poured forth: the Grumman Hellcat, the Lockheed Lightning, and the North American Mustang. Each came not in handfuls, but in floods, each refined not over decades, but over months, each backed by the certainty that replacements would always follow. Japanese aviators, once supremely confident, now faced swarms of fresh opponents. Even when they scored kills, the victory felt hollow. For another squadron would soon take their place. The shock deepened with the realization that American pilots trained differently because they could afford to. In Japan, pilot training was long, expensive, and limited, producing a cadre of elite but irreplaceable warriors. Losses could not be replenished quickly. In America, training programs were vast, accelerated, and sustained by endless machines. Thousands of cadets practiced relentlessly, knowing that if they crashed a plane, another would be waiting. The machine was expendable. The pilot was the investment. To Japanese generals, this doctrine bordered on madness. They had built their strategy around conserving strength, protecting precious equipment, and valuing the individual warrior above all. The Americans inverted this logic. Planes were disposable, pilots were renewable. And victory lay not in the brilliance of a few aces, but in the grinding accumulation of superiority. This was the hidden advantage, not simply that America built more planes, but that it had built an entire system to sustain war at a scale no other nation could imagine. It was a system that fed itself: factories producing planes, planes delivering supplies, supplies feeding armies, and armies seizing islands that in turn opened new supply routes. The cycle was self-reinforcing, an ever-tightening noose around Japan's empire on distant islands. Japanese commanders began to sense it. At Guadalcanal, American aircraft arrived in waves, each week stronger than the last, as if the jungle itself were birthing new machines. At Tarawa, the skies darkened with bombers, their engines humming in endless procession. At Saipan and Guam, the sheer volume of aircraft blotted out the horizon. The Japanese could not rotate squadrons fast enough, could not replace pilots quickly enough, and could not build planes in numbers to match that in Tokyo. Disbelief gave way to dread. Reports piled up: 10,000 American aircraft produced in a month, 20,000 more waiting in depots. An arsenal so vast it could equip multiple fronts simultaneously: the Pacific, North Africa, Italy, and soon, France. Japanese generals stared at these numbers as if they were illusions. They had prepared for a war of daring strikes and sudden victories. What they faced instead was an avalanche, and beneath it all was the bitter truth they could no longer deny. America's hidden advantage was not merely industrial capacity, but the ability to turn capacity into certainty. For every Japanese plane that fell, 10 American machines rose in its place. For every Japanese pilot who perished, 5 more Americans took to the skies. It was not just a contest of battles anymore, but of factories, and in that war, Japan had already lost. Engines roared like thunder inside cavernous halls of steel and glass. Sparks cascaded from welding torches, casting fleeting constellations across the factory ceilings. It was here, in the heart of America's industrial might, that the war was truly being won. The hidden advantage the Japanese generals could scarcely comprehend was not a mystery of strategy or morale. It was the cold, mechanical reality of production. Each rivet, each bolt, each assembly line rhythm carried with it the destiny of empires. Consider the bomber that symbolized this power, the consolidated B-24 Liberator. With a wingspan of 110 feet and a range of over 2,000 miles, it was a machine built for endurance and destruction. At Willow Run, the sprawling factory in Ypsilanti, Michigan, this Leviathan was not built in workshops or hangars, but on a moving line more than a mile long. Conveyor belts carried wings and fuselages past teams of thousands. Women in overalls, once secretaries and housewives, drilled metal plates with pneumatic precision. Men who had built automobiles now riveted aluminum skin to skeletal frames. At its peak, Willow Run delivered one finished bomber every 63 minutes. By the war's end, more than 8,600 B-24s thundered into the skies from this single plant alone. Contrast this with Japanese production. Their vaunted Mitsubishi A6M0, sleek, maneuverable, and deadly in 1941, was built painstakingly by skilled craftsmen. Each plane required more than 9,000 man-hours to complete. Replacement parts were scarce, tolerances were unique, and maintenance was slow. By comparison, the B-24 was designed for modular construction. Wings from one plant, engines from another, and armaments from yet another, all shipped and assembled like clockwork. What the Japanese built by hand, America built by system, and the system extended beyond bombers. The P-51 Mustang, born in a matter of months at North American Aviation, was a masterpiece of engineering speed. Originally designed with an Allison engine, its transformation came when fitted with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. The result was a fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, with a speed of over 430 miles per hour and a service ceiling above 40,000 feet. Factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, produced more than 15,000 Mustangs by the war's end. Japan, meanwhile, could never field a long-range escort fighter in similar numbers. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 99,950 bombers, 96,318 fighters, and 23,929 transports, along with tens of thousands of trainers and reconnaissance planes. Japan, during the same years, built fewer than 76,000 aircraft in total. Even at its peak in 1944, Japanese industry produced just over 28,000 planes, less than one-third of American output that year alone. The specifications reveal another hidden layer: quality intertwined with quantity. The American Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, a twin-row radial masterpiece, powered legends like the P-47 Thunderbolt, F-6F Hellcat, and F-4U Corsair. Delivering 2,000 horsepower with remarkable reliability, it could be mass-produced in the tens of thousands. Japanese engines, such as the Nakajima Sakae, were lighter but weaker, producing under 1,200 horsepower. Worse, Japan lacked the high-octane fuel necessary to fully exploit performance. America not only built superior engines, but also refined millions of gallons of aviation fuel, shipped by convoys that dwarfed Japanese logistics. Radios, too, told a story of disparity. American aircraft carried SCR-522 and SCR-274N radios that allowed coordination across squadrons and formations. Japanese planes often lacked reliable communication equipment, forcing pilots to rely on hand signals or rigid formations. The result was predictable. American pilots adapted fluidly in combat, while Japanese units fractured once leaders were shot down. Even the nuts and bolts of production revealed the gulf. Aluminum output in the United States surged from 327,000 tons in 1940 to over 2 million tons in 1943. Entire dams, like the Grand Coulee in Washington, were constructed or expanded to power aluminum smelters. Japan, with no such abundance, scavenged scrap metal, melted down civilian goods, and eventually substituted wood for metal in desperate attempts to keep production alive. Factories became fortresses of innovation. In Seattle, Boeing perfected the B-17 Flying Fortress, a bomber bristling with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns and capable of absorbing punishing damage before returning home. In California, Douglas churned out the C-47 Skitran, the workhorse transport that would drop paratroopers into Normandy and haul supplies over the Himalayas. In New Jersey, Curtiss-Wright turned out the P-40 Warhawk, the fighter that held the line in the war's earliest months. The rhythm was relentless: design, test, build, deliver. Failures were corrected not in years, but in weeks. Meanwhile, Japan struggled with shortages. Factories bombed in raids could not be rebuilt quickly. Skilled workers were conscripted, replaced by untrained laborers. Planes left assembly lines with defects. Engines failed prematurely, and materials grew scarce. The once feared Zero, by 1944, was outclassed in both speed and firepower, yet Japan had no replacement in comparable numbers. Where America surged forward with Hellcats, Lightnings, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs, Japan was left trying to modernize too late, too little, and all of this was backed by a workforce mobilized like an army. 6 million women entered the factories, immortalized as Rosie the Riveter. Immigrants, farmers, and former students labored side by side in round-the-clock shifts. American industry ran not on daylight hours, but on the relentless cycle of 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Japanese industry, plagued by resource starvation and air raids, could never match the tempo. The sheer logistics staggered imagination. To build 100,000 planes required not only aluminum and engines, but also tires, instruments, machine guns, radios, and miles of wiring. The United States produced 646,000 aircraft engines, 808,000 propellers, and billions of rounds of ammunition. Japanese factories, cut off by submarine blockades, simply could not compete. Every American production statistic was a hammer blow against Japanese hopes. It was this technical, industrial deep dive that revealed the true imbalance of the Pacific War. Japan could launch daring strikes, field skilled pilots, and design elegant machines. But America could summon an endless tide of steel and fire. Each bomber that roared into the sky carried not only its crew, but also the weight of an entire industrial system. A system so vast, so efficient, that it seemed less like human effort and more like a force of nature. For the Japanese generals staring at the mounting losses, the realization must have felt like watching a tidal wave gather on the horizon. No matter how sharp the sword, no warrior could stand against the flood. 1944. The skies above Lorraine, France, shimmered with the haze of autumn. Low clouds drifted across rolling fields scarred by tank tracks and artillery fire. Beneath them, in the town of Aircourt, German panzer divisions prepared for an assault they believed would crush the advancing Americans. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had promised air cover. Commanders expected their Panthers and Mark IVs to be shielded by squadrons of experienced pilots. But as the first shafts of sunlight broke through, the horizon filled with the distant drone of engines, not German, but American, and not in handfuls, but in swarms. The U.S. Third Army, commanded by General George S. Patton, had unleashed the 2nd Cavalry Group and the 4th Armored Division across Lorraine. But their true edge did not lie in the tanks alone. Overhead, the 9th Air Force sent in wave after wave of aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts, nicknamed the Jug, thundered through the clouds, their radial engines roaring, their wings bristling with bombs and .50 caliber machine guns. They did not arrive in 2s or 3s. They came in formations dozens strong, blotting out the morning sun. German tank crews, veterans of the Eastern Front, had seen Sturmovix and hurricanes before. But what they faced at Aircourt was different. Each time they destroyed one American plane, another appeared. Each sortie that ended in smoke and fire was followed by fresh squadrons. The Luftwaffe, crippled by shortages and overwhelmed by losses, could send only a fraction of its promised support. For every German fighter that clawed into the skies, 10 American Thunderbolts descended. The battle unfolded with merciless precision. At dawn, German Panthers advanced cautiously through the mist, their long 75mm guns searching for prey. They had the advantage in armor and firepower, their steel hulls impervious to most Allied tank shells at long range. But the Americans had rewritten the rules of combat. The radio crackled inside every Thunderbolt cockpit, guiding pilots to their targets with the speed of modern coordination. Spotters on the ground relayed positions. Within minutes, P-47 swooped low, their bombs detonating among the German columns. Their guns stitching fiery trails across open fields. The Panthers, built for duels against Soviet armor, found themselves exposed to a new kind of predator. Their thick frontal plates meant little when rockets slammed into their thinner roofs. Their formations, designed for coordinated advances, broke apart as airstrikes tore holes in their lines. Tank commanders, blinded by smoke and chaos, struggled to regroup. Japanese generals, thousands of miles away, studied reports of these European battles with disbelief. If America could deploy such overwhelming force in France, what chance did Japan's scattered island garrisons have in the Pacific? At Airport, the evidence was undeniable. America's skies were endless, its aircraft inexhaustible, and its pilots coordinated by radios and guided by a logistical system that replaced losses overnight. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In just 10 days of fighting, American forces destroyed nearly 86 German tanks, while losing only 25 of their own. More than half of those German losses came not from tank duels, but from the relentless assault of P-47s. German after-action reports carried a tone of bewilderment. The enemy possesses an inexhaustible supply of aircraft. Our losses are severe. We cannot maintain momentum. This pattern repeated across the world. In the Pacific, it was not just Thunderbolts, but also Hellcats and Corsairs that dominated. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Japanese Navy sought to halt America's advance. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa deployed more than 400 aircraft from his carriers, hoping to overwhelm the American fleet. But the U.S. Navy countered with over 900 planes, most of them F-6F Hellcats launched from Essex-class carriers built in rapid succession at American shipyards. The result was carnage on a scale that stunned even hardened veterans. Over the course of 2 days, American pilots shot down more than 600 Japanese aircraft. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For every Hellcat lost, 10 Japanese planes fell. Pilots returning to their carriers spoke with disbelief at the ease of the slaughter. For the Japanese, the nightmare was complete. Their finest aviators had been annihilated, their carriers rendered defenseless, and their air power crippled beyond repair. Back in Tokyo, generals read the reports in silence. They had believed in the superiority of their pilots, in the discipline of their formations, and in the lethality of their Zero fighters. But none of that mattered against the industrial avalanche now crashing down upon them. America could lose hundreds of planes in a single battle and replace them within days. Japan could not. Even German officers, whose armies still fought savagely across Europe, admitted the truth. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring remarked bitterly that America's strength was not in strategy, but in numbers. They replace everything. Planes, tanks, men. The factory replaces what the battlefield destroys. For the Japanese, whose factories were already straining under bombing raids, this truth was more terrifying still than at Airport. The fields were littered with the twisted hulks of Panthers and Panzers. Smoke curled upward from wreckage, mingling with the black streaks of downed planes. But while the Germans counted each loss with dread, the Americans simply marked another order fulfilled. Replacement planes rolled out of factories even as the battle raged. Replacement pilots, trained in the thousands, stood ready to take to the skies. The Japanese generals could not believe the reports. One American factory, Willow Run, had produced more bombers in a single year than Japan had produced combat aircraft in the entire war to that point. And that was only one factory, one cog in the vast machine of American industry. The Battle of Airport and the skies of the Marianas were proof. America's advantage was not abstract. It was visible in the wreckage of German tanks, in the shattered remains of Japanese carriers, and in the endless drone of engines overhead. This was the first major demonstration of what mass production truly meant on the battlefield. Wars were no longer decided by the brilliance of a general or the courage of a single squadron. They were decided by whether a nation could build, sustain, and replace. In that contest, the United States had no equal, and as the sun set over Lorraine, the fields quiet except for the crackling of burning steel, one lesson was seared into the minds of every observer. In modern war, survival depended not only on bravery or firepower, but on whether your factories could outproduce the enemy's. The war was no longer fought only in jungles, deserts, or storm-tossed seas. It was waged in the minds of men, generals, soldiers, and entire nations grappling with the reality that America's skies were bottomless. To the Japanese high command, this realization struck with a psychological force greater than any bomb. Each month, new intelligence reports painted the same picture. While Japan bled itself dry to replace a handful of aircraft, America flooded its fronts with hundreds, sometimes thousands. As if conjured out of thin air, the impact was strategic, vast, and relentless. In Europe, Allied commanders relied on American production to open new fronts with confidence. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, was shielded by nearly 13,000 aircraft, the majority American-built. Bombers darkened the skies, transports dropped paratroopers in waves, and fighters prowled the air with impunity. German soldiers on the ground were paralyzed not by fear of infantry or tanks, but by the ceaseless roar above them. Every move, every daylight maneuver, risked annihilation from the AIRI in the Pacific. The effect was even more suffocating. Japanese garrisons marooned on islands, Truk, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, faced daily air raids. They looked skyward to see formation after formation of bombers, escorted by swarms of fighters that seemed never to diminish. The defenders clung to their courage, but in their hearts they understood the truth. Their empire was being strangled from above, its lifelines severed by sheer industrial weight. American pilots, too, felt the difference. Confidence radiated through their ranks because they knew they were never alone. A damaged Hellcat or Thunderbolt could limp home, secure in the knowledge that reinforcements would fill the gap. Pilots rotated in and out, trained replacements always waiting. Morale thrived on this sense of abundance. In contrast, Japanese aviators flew with the weight of finality. Every mission might be their last, for both themselves and their aircraft. Losses were irreplaceable, and survival carried no guarantee of relief. The doctrine of war itself shifted under this pressure. German and Japanese strategies hinged on decisive blows, blitzkrieg thrusts, surprise raids, and lightning victories. But America's approach was cumulative, attritional, and grinding. It was not brilliance in a single stroke, but pressure applied endlessly, like the tide against a cliff. And slowly, inevitably, that cliff began to crumble. Japanese generals, steeped in traditions of honor and individual valor, could not grasp this new kind of warfare at first. They believed in the pilot as a warrior, the plane as his sword, and each loss as a wound to the nation's spirit. America, by contrast, treated war as arithmetic. Planes were numbers on a ledger, production quotas to be met, and deliveries to be scheduled. The individual mattered, but the system was supreme. This cold, mechanical logic horrified Japanese commanders even as it overwhelmed them. The psychological toll was devastating. In the aftermath of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, surviving Japanese pilots returned to their carriers in silence. Their ranks had been annihilated, their comrades gone. They had not been defeated by superior skill, but by a tidal wave of machines. "The enemy's planes are endless," one report lamented. "They come like locusts, unceasing, swarming, without fear." The words carried despair that no discipline could erase. That on the home front, the contrast was equally stark. In America, workers took pride in their contribution, each rivet and weld a blow against tyranny. Posters proclaimed, "The man behind the hammer strikes harder than the man with the gun." Morale swelled with each announcement of record production. In Japan, by contrast, civilians endured shortages, rationing, and air raids. Factories were bombed, homes burned, and families lived with the knowledge that their sacrifices could not match the enemy's capacity. The spirit of the Japanese people was strong, but spirit alone could not replace steel. Strategically, the American advantage reshaped the battlefield. Commanders planned operations knowing that losses would be replenished. At Leyte Gulf, fleets clashed with ferocity, yet within weeks damaged American carriers were repaired, their air wings restored. Japanese losses, once sustained, were permanent. This asymmetry gave Allied leaders freedom of initiative. They could take risks, knowing the industrial machine stood behind them. Japan, conversely, became increasingly cautious, its once aggressive strategy devolving into desperate defense. Even German allies recognized the psychological impact. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, facing American air power in North Africa, remarked bitterly that daylight movement was impossible. "The enemy's air force sees everything. It strikes without pause. We fight under constant eyes." Japanese generals facing similar devastation across the Pacific must have felt the same suffocating despair. No maneuver, no tactic, and no sudden strike could reverse the fact that their enemy's skies were inexhaustible. The legacy of this psychological war extended beyond battles. The kamikaze campaign itself, young men flinging their lives away in desperate suicide attacks, was born of hopelessness against the American tide. Japan could not match numbers, so it sought to weaponize sacrifice. But even this grim tactic could not halt the factories. For every ship damaged by a kamikaze, two more rolled out of American yards. And each new carrier launched fresh squadrons to the Pacific. In the end, the strategic and psychological impacts converged into one truth. America had broken the calculus of war. Japan had gambled on a short conflict, believing the United States too soft for endurance. But America had proven that endurance was its greatest strength. With factories humming, supply lines unbroken, and skies crowded with aircraft, the war was no longer about who fought bravely, but about who could fight longest. And in that contest, Japan's generals stared into an abyss they could not escape. Their empire, vast though it had seemed, was shrinking under the weight of American industry. Each island lost, each base destroyed, was not merely a military defeat, but a psychological one. The soldiers still fought with courage, the pilots still flew with skill, but in their hearts they knew they were outmatched by something greater than themselves. It was not the courage of men that decided the war, but the relentless rhythm of machines. And for the Japanese high command, that realization was more terrifying than any enemy fleet. In the final months of the war, the skies above Japan themselves bore witness to the legacy of America's industrial miracle. The thunder of B-29 superfortresses became a nightly ritual, their contrails painting pale scars across the heavens. These massive bombers, each carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, were not a handful of prototypes or experimental marvels. They were legions, thousands strong, and each one a child of the same vast factory system that had overwhelmed Germany and now crushed Japan. From the firestorms of Tokyo to the smoldering ruins of Nagoya, the message was unrelenting. America had built not just an air force, but an industrial hurricane. The Japanese generals, once so confident in their warrior traditions, were forced to confront a bitter truth. Their pilots had fought bravely. Their infantry had endured impossible conditions. Their fleets had struck with precision and daring. But courage and discipline could not compete with factories that never slept. America had mastered not only the battlefield, but also the blueprint of modern war: to fight with numbers, with coordination, and with the inexhaustible rhythm of production. In the ashes of Tokyo, even before surrender, whispers among Japanese officers admitted the same haunting refrain: we built better warriors. But they built more machines. And those machines had carried the day. The legacy extended far beyond 1945. In the new world that emerged, the lesson was indelible. Wars of the future would not be decided by singular acts of bravery or by the elegance of a fighter plane's design. They would be decided by whether a nation could mobilize its resources, organize its people, and connect its forces through networks of supply and communication. America's wartime factories had proven that industrial might was not merely support for soldiers. It was the battlefield itself. This truth echoed into the Cold War. The Soviet Union, watching America's feats of mass production, sought to match them with its own sprawling complexes in the Urals and Siberia. The United States, meanwhile, retained its doctrine of industrial preparedness, ensuring that its factories and scientific laboratories could pivot to war if ever called upon again. The concept of total war, where every citizen, every factory, and every field becomes part of the fight, was now a permanent part of military doctrine, even in later conflicts. The shadow of America's World War II production loomed large. In Korea and Vietnam, U.S. forces drew upon the same logistical lessons, ensuring that their soldiers were never without air support or supplies. In the Gulf War of 1991, America demonstrated once more that industrial organization and technological dominance could overwhelm an enemy in weeks. The connection was clear, the blueprint written in the 1940s, where production lines became front lines, had defined warfare for the century to come. The psychological impact lingered as well. For the Japanese people, the memory of the industrial avalanche was seared into national identity. The firebombings, the endless waves of aircraft, the sheer scale of destruction, all of it underscored the futility of fighting a nation that could produce 100,000 planes in 4 years. In the post-war years, Japan turned its focus away from militarism and toward economic growth, channeling its talent for precision and craftsmanship into industry, but this time for peace. The factories once used for warplanes now built cars, electronics, and ships, still a legacy of industrial discipline, but redirected from destruction to prosperity. For America, the war confirmed its place as a superpower. The factories that had delivered tanks, planes, and ships by the millions now gave the United States the confidence of a nation that had not only fought but also produced its way to victory. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signing Germany's surrender, had admitted bitterly, "We built better tanks. But you built tanks that work together." The Japanese officers who watched the rising sun replaced by the stars and stripes might have said something similar about the skies. "We built brave pilots. But they built planes that never ended." The lesson is timeless, universal, and sobering. In war, spirit matters. Courage matters. Strategy matters. But without the means to sustain them, they crumble like sand against the tide. America's 100,000 planes were not just machines of aluminum and rivets. They were symbols of a deeper truth, that connection, production, and endurance outweigh firepower alone. The Japanese generals who had once believed America weak could not comprehend what they saw. Factories building bombers like toys, workers laboring in endless shifts, and supply lines stretching across oceans. To them, it was as if America had summoned an army of steel giants, each one born from a furnace, each one carrying the weight of a continent's will. And so the war ended not with the clash of fleets or the duel of champions, but with the quiet inevitability of numbers fulfilled. Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the final blows, but the war had been lost long before in the factories of Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles. The mushroom clouds were the punctuation. The story had already been written by the drone of 100,000 engines to eye in the stillness that followed. As the world rebuilt from ruins, one truth remained etched into history. In modern war, it is not the sharpest sword or the bravest soldier that decides victory. It is the nation that can turn its factories into weapons, its people into producers, and its skies into an endless storm. The Japanese generals could not believe it then, but history has proven it ever since. In the wars of the 20th century and beyond, speed defeated armor, networks defeated isolation, and production, relentless, unstoppable production, defeated valor. And so the final lesson endures in the furnace of modern conflict. Courage alone is not enough. In the end, it is the factory that wins the war.